What are the most common retirement questions that financial planners get? Well, today we're beginning the first of a 10-part series that looks at these most common retirement questions. And joining us to discuss that is Dana Anspach from Sensible Money. Dana, welcome.
Thanks, Bob. As always, great to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. And I'm eager to hear about the most common questions that you receive about retirement. What's number one on your list?
Well, of course, number one is, can I afford to retire? Everybody wants to know, do I have enough? When can I retire? Could I pull the trigger tomorrow? Is it 5 more years? And there's a lot, as you know, that goes into that question.
So where do you start?
Well, ultimately, it's a math problem. And when we say it's a math problem, it's a complex math problem. You're starting usually with, what do you want to spend? Now, I know some planners or simplistic rules of thumb will start at the opposite end. So we've often heard of the 4% rule, which says that you can withdraw approximately 4% of your portfolio value and reasonably expect that to last for life.
Mhm.
And so you could start there and then add in your Social Security and any other sources of income you might have from a pension or from a deferred comp or for rental income and go, well, that's what I have to budget off of. That is one way of doing it, but when we say do the math, that isn't actually quite what we're talking about. We think that gives you a really good overview, a starting point, but doing the math starts with, what is my take-home pay now? What am I spending? What items will change as I shift into retirement? Maybe my employer is covering most of my healthcare expenses now, but I'll be paying for more of those out of pocket. Maybe I have kids that are going off the payroll about the time that I'm entering retirement. So that portion of my budget, will be freed up. So it's creating this timeline of where you expect your spending to be. Then charting that against the various income sources you have that are certain income sources, things like Social Security or pensions. And then calculating, we call it the gap, then what is left between what you're going to spend, the guaranteed sources you have coming in, and that's what you would have to withdraw out of your portfolio each year. And then projecting that out and saying, well, if I draw out that much, will my money last? Will it last for as long as I do? So that's really what we mean when we say doing the math. It's digging into the details and using a planning tool that has the capability to put this all into a model over a 30 or sometimes even 40-year forward-looking time horizon.
Right. So two questions. Oftentimes people may not know what they're going to spend in retirement, and they're told to just use a ballpark number like 80% of your pre-retirement income is what you might spend in retirement. Firstly, any thoughts about that as a place to start?
Again, I think if you're far away from retirement, it can give you a ballpark. But when you apply that 80% rule to different demographics, so let's say I have someone making 50 or 60,000 a year versus someone making 160,000 a year. Well, that person making 50,000 a year might be putting 5 or 10% into their 401k plan, and Social Security might replace a very large portion of their income. And so they may actually be spending more than 80% in retirement. That person that makes 160,000 may be maxing out their 401k, putting, the 26,500 a year and plus additional savings. And so they may be spending less than 80%. And so I think when we say do the math, it's, you have to look at your individual situation, or at least the demographic group that you're in, to see, does this rule of thumb apply to me? And in some cases, it does not.
Yeah. So the second question has to do with a phrase that Bill Sharp, right, Nobel Prize winner, used to say, or still does, about retirement being one of the thorniest, hardest problems to solve that he's ever faced. And partly it's due because of the planning horizon is uncertain. So as you think about expenses, those expenses could last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and the income to support those expenses also needs to last 10 or 20 or 30 years. We don't know. How do you solve for that math?
Yeah, it is definitely a thorny math problem. I like that analogy. It's really about providing a range of potential outcomes. We don't know the future. We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know what inflation's going to be. We don't know if we're going to get a time period in the markets where they have above average returns. We've seen time periods with double digit returns and time periods with single digit returns. And so when you create a modeling process that accounts for all of those different factors and says, well, if you had the worst combination of factors, this was what would have happened. And if you had the best combination of factors, this is what would have happened. Now you can say, well, I want a plan that's going to work even if I had the worst combination of factors. And if I get something better than that, great, I'll be able to travel more, or I'll be able to leave more to my children, or perhaps gift to them along the way. And so our way of addressing that is to address the uncertainty and saying, here's a range of potential outcomes. We need to know your plan's going to work, even if reality turns out to be in the bottom half of this range.
Right. So when I think about the question, can I afford to retire? The other thing I think about is retirement risks that you'll face, and whether you've actually managed or mitigate these risks, because if you haven't, perhaps you can't afford to retire.
Yeah, and some of those risks we've talked about, how long we're going to live. I have had numerous clients over the year when I will project their plan out, let's say even to 90. I've had people, not as frequently now, but I used to have people who would say, well, I'm not going to live that long. And I'd say, well, what if you do? And so people routinely underestimate how long they might live. So that's a risk to say, what if you do live that long? We need to make sure there's enough. Some of the other risks I see are really on the expense side. It could be a health event that takes you out of the workforce earlier than you had planned. And so you are forced into retirement, perhaps at 60 or 62 when you had thought you would work till 65 or 67. Also with adult children. So an adult child may develop a substance abuse problem, or, a job loss for a period of time, a mental health problem. I've had clients encounter all of these things, where I've had one client that got custody of a grandchild, and now they had to get that one through school and offer a lot of support there. So those are some of the shocks that we think about, where you need to have some money that's part of your plan that you didn't put in the pool as available for retirement cash flow. It's a reserve pool that says, if one of these household shocks should show up, I have this reserve asset that can help me ride out. Sometimes I've called them these curveballs that can come along.
All right. Dana, we covered a lot of ground. Anything we missed, or anything that just bears reemphasizing?
I think that covers the broad spectrum. We could spend hours on figuring out, like, how do you determine how much it takes to retire? But that covers, I think, the broad spectrum of really what you need to look at.
All right. So I think in our next episode, we're going to tackle whether you and your spouse or partner should retire at the same time. Looking forward to that one.
Yes, we are.